Hey everyone, it's your Peacekeeper, and I've got a video that many of you guys have been asking for, and that is kind of a where do I aim or what shell type do I use style of video. So we're going to call this my aiming guide. But before we dive into the aiming guide, I really want to start covering some of the basics of World of Warships gunnery side. We're not going to talk about torpedoes. I have a whole separate video on that you can watch. I'll link it down in the description. All right, so the basics. Let's start off with, 101. What is a high explosive or armor-piercing round? Well, a high explosive round is a general-purpose round. In fact, these rounds are actually called common rounds in actual naval terminology. They have the added bonus, as well as their damage, of having the potential to start fires, and they do damage so long as they get some form of penetrating hit, whether that's an over-penetration or a penetrating hit, and they have a chance to start a fire regardless of whether or not they penetrate. So long as they impact, there is a chance that they will start a fire. Armor-piercing rounds are what we think of when we see, big old battleship shells sitting on the deck of museum ships. That's basically what we're going to be talking about because, well, that's what a lot of these ships fired at other ships. It wasn't very common to shoot common rounds at enemy warships simply because armor-piercing rounds were designed to go through armor. Common rounds weren't. There are a couple of examples out there, like Iowa and New Jersey fired common rounds at Katori when they sank Katori at Truck Lagoon. They did the same thing with Milwaukee as she was fleeing, but armor-piercing rounds are rounds that are specialized in penetrating through armor. They have a really hard nose to them that helps them penetrate that armor, and these rounds will do very high levels of damage against broadside targets. Now, how do I know what each shell does damage-wise? Well, we're going to use the North Carolina here as an example. If you go into your artillery tab when you're in the port and hover over your main battery, you can see there it's going to tell you what the HE shell is. In this case, it's a 16-inch Mark 13. The AP shell is a 16-inch Mark 8. That's a super heavy shell. It'll tell you what their damage is. So that's max damage. That's 5,700 damage for the North Carolina's HE shell. And that is if it gets a Citadel hit. Yes, HE shells can get a Citadel hit. And we'll talk about what that is in a minute. The Mark 8, the AP shell, does 13,100 damage, and again, that is going to be in the Citadel hits only. That's not going to be just a normal penetrating hit. Also, you'll notice there that it has the chance to start a fire. You can also see the maximum dispersion. We're not going to talk about dispersion in this video because World of Warships does things differently than in real life, but the fire chance, that number there it's not the whole story. It gives you a pretty good idea, but each tier of ship has a reduction number that gets applied to that number. And so it's more or less just a generalization, not so much a hard and fast rule. So this won't always start a shell, or this won't always start a fire out of every turret, basically, is what that would amount to. It won't do that. There's some other things in there, including RNG. Interestingly enough, you can also check this out on the secondaries, and you can see that the secondaries on the North Carolina fire HE. Okay, so what's a Citadel? We've mentioned that. The Citadel is, according to Wargaming, it's going to be the machinery spaces and the magazines of guns over a certain caliber, which in this case is anything larger than 5 inches, but not including 5 inches. So I've got the North Carolina here in the armor viewer. Just hit armor layout. If you turn everything off except for this last one, and actually the last two, you will see what they will call Citadel spaces. Now, the Citadel spaces on this, you can see here, it's marked Citadel, Citadel, Citadel. There's also main battery, what they call barbette armor, which is the actual armored cylinder that the turret sat in. Any hits to those can be Citadel hits, although overwhelmingly, the barbettes not so much, and the turrets not so much. Generally speaking, you will get a either an incapacitation of the main battery where it knocks it out temporarily, or you'll destroy it outright if you hit the main barbette and penetrate. But anything that's marked Citadel is going to be a Citadel space. So you can see here, we'll drop the magazine, you can see here that the Citadel is, pretty hard to hit. The water line is going to be basically where the red is, the top of this. So you can see, we've got some armor there. So any shells that hit this, penetrate the armor belt, and then detonate inside this space are going to be a Citadel hit. And that is going to allow whichever shell it is you fire, HE or AP, to do that maximum damage number. So there are 5 possible outcomes of what happens when you shoot at an enemy. The first is you miss, which is obviously a non-damaging hit. The second option is that you penetrate. Third is that you over-penetrate. Fourth is that your shell shatters on impact. And the last option is that your shell ricochets. Now, penetrating hits can be split into what are called normal hits, normal penetrating hits, and then also Citadel hits. So you've got normal and Citadel hits. Normal penetrations will only yield 33% of the listed damage of the shell. So if you do 10,000 damage, your actual normal penetration is going to be 3,333. The over penetrations, going back, Citadel hits are going to be 100%. Normal penetrations are 33%. Over penetrations are only 10% of the shell's listed shell damage. Ricochets are when a shell bounces off the target. That does 0 damage. Shatters are when the shell impacts armor but doesn't have sufficient penetration to actually penetrate the armor plate. That also does 0 damage. High explosive follows the same pattern, except for high explosive shells don't ricochet. They are pretty much guaranteed to explode. They are either going to penetrate. In theory, it's possible, although in execution it doesn't happen. You can over-penetrate. I've not personally seen it happen, but it is allowed in the game for it to over-penetrate. That might become a thing later on if we get some countries that have common shells with really long fuse times. And you can also Citadel hit, and the shells can shatter on impact. No matter what happens, though, HE shells are almost always going to have a chance to start a fire. So where do I aim at then? Where on a ship do I aim using what shell type? Well, if you're in a destroyer, we'll bring up gearing here. If you are in a destroyer, basically, your shells are only going to be effective when they impact the superstructure of the ship that you're firing at. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, but overwhelmingly, when you're shooting at ships, aside from other destroyers, superstructure hits are where you're going to want to hit. And that's because you're primarily going to be firing HE out of these things. And there are a couple destroyers that do benefit from shooting AP. Akizuki in the Japanese line, that's the anti-aircraft destroyer with the really fast-firing 4-inch guns. The Russian destroyers can get away with it, and then the Germans, because they have specialized armor-piercing rounds that they do pretty decent damage. But overwhelmingly, though, HE is going to be your primary choice when shooting, out of a destroyer at other targets. Now, there are exceptions to this as well. At close ranges, armor piercing from even just these little 5-inch guns against cruisers can cause Citadel hits, and with the rate of fire of some of these guns, you can melt enemy cruisers that are presenting a broadside profile to you. So don't hesitate if you're within, about 5k or so from most cruisers to switch to AP if they present a broadside to you, because you'd be surprised at how easy it is to get Citadel hits, and with the rate of fire, it adds up pretty quick. Now, let's go talk about what happens if we're in a cruiser. Now, cruisers are basically going to follow the same pattern as destroyers. You're primarily going to be firing HE at the superstructure of ships. The AP is going to depend on what you're shooting at. If you're shooting at a battleship, you're going to want to aim at kind of the superstructure. Really, you want to aim at this area that's the top part of the hull plating here. And what that's going to do is that's going to penetrate. Here, we'll do this. So you can see this green area on Baltimore. If you aim in this area on even a battleship, you'll see that on a battleship there's a whole section. Oop, we got to get it up here. That's what she said. A Okay, so you can see here, this green section here, it's only 32 millimeters. If you get shells that impact in here, you're going to get normal penetrating hits with your 6 or 8 inch AP, and that's going to add up very quickly. You can also shoot AP and HE at the fore ends of some battleships, especially US battleships that use the all or nothing armor scheme, which is going to start, basically the New York on. You can shoot at the ends of the ship, so the bow and the stern, and you can see here that these areas you will get HE penetrations as well as AP penetrations if for whatever reason the superstructure has no more hit points. We won't cover saturation of hitboxes in this one. Now, you will also benefit from shooting AP from a cruiser at other cruisers presenting a broadside profile because they don't have a whole lot of armor. In Baltimore's case, 6 inches of belt armor. AP shells that impact this are, especially at a broadside profile, they have a pretty high chance of getting a Citadel hit, which again adds up quite heavily. Now, battleships... This is going to probably draw some ire from some people because I personally do not shoot anything but AP. It doesn't matter if I'm shooting at a destroyer or shooting at a carrier. And the reason why is by the time a destroyer pops up, I get the guns on target, and he disappears, I may only get enough time to basically pull the trigger at him. It's very rare for a destroyer to stay popped up for long enough for me to switch to HE, which, is 30 seconds if you don't have expert loader. And quite honestly, what I've noticed is that AP is extremely effective against destroyers. And it doesn't matter if it overpens, because one overpen could be 1/10 to 1/15 of a destroyer's hit point pool, or even 1/20th if it's some of the higher tier ones. And it only takes a couple of those to deal 4,000 or 5,000 damage, which can be a quarter of their hit point pool in one shell hit. Plus, if you happen to get one normal pen or even a couple normal penetrations, you can devastating strike. You can completely delete them with a couple of just normal penetrations if they're even angled just a little bit. And you can't really effectively do that with HE. What HE is useful for, coming from a battleship, is basically knocking out modules on those ships. So if a destroyer is really close and you just happen to have HE loaded, you can shoot HE at them and you can knock out, their engines or the rudder or guns, or more importantly, their torpedoes, especially if they're trying to make an attack run on you, which that can reset the reload timer for those torpedoes, which might save you, might not. Personally, I just leave AP loaded all the time. And where to shoot at? Well, waterline. Basically, if it presents a broadside profile to you, you're going to aim at the waterline, because most battleships have enough penetration in their shells to actually penetrate into the citadels of enemy ships. Now, some ships like the North Carolina are difficult to citadel, but not impossible. And that's going to deal the most damage. Now, what happens if I got a ship that's, presenting this profile to me or is angled to me? Where do I aim then? Me personally, I'm going to aim, because I know that all of this hull plating is not going to allow a penetration, especially at this angle or straight on. Where I'm going to aim is actually up here in the superstructure, and I want my shells to hit. There's a really heavily armored place here called the conning tower. I basically want to hit this area and behind it, and that's going to increase the chances of you getting normal penetrating hits as well as over penetrating hits. It's at least damage when they're presenting this profile to you. Now, there are special circumstances in which you can shoot at a ship that is presenting this profile to you and get a Citadel hit. And it's going to require a little bit of math and an understanding of, what and where the Citadel is on a ship and what the armor thickness is. But before we talk about that, I get it a lot. Where do I aim at on X or Y ship? Well, my recommendation is, again, to break out the armor viewer. That's going to tell you everything you need to know. And again, you're basically going to dump everything except for the last two options, and that's going to give you a pretty good idea. Now, on battleships, these barbettes, they generally speaking don't count as Citadel hits, but the magazine spaces below them do. And there are ships, maybe Baltimore is one of them, No, it doesn't look like it. Sometimes you will see the magazine pop up that is also a Citadel, so definitely something to pay attention to in Armor Viewer. Now let's go back to talking about that situation where a ship is bow on to you, and you want to know if you can shoot through its front end or not. This is called Overmatch, and Overmatch is the mechanic. It's the ability of a shell, an armor-piercing shell specifically, to penetrate an angled armor plate regardless of the angle it presents to you. And it requires some math, and basically if you take the caliber of the shell in millimeters, so in this case it's 406 millimeters, and divide it by 14.3, it will give you the minimum thickness of armor necessary to prevent an overmatch. And I want to say it's 26 millimeters. Let me do some quick math here. Basically, what happens is a shell of certain thickness will penetrate that number regardless. Okay, so 28 millimeters and below, it will automatically penetrate. Now, you can see here that the North Carolina has 32 millimeters of front plate, and thus you're not penetrating it at all. But there is one ship in the game that can, and it is all the way down here, and it is Yamato. Now, Yamato's 460 millimeter guns, we take 460 and we divide it by 14.3, and we get 32.167, which means basically, if you have 32 millimeters of armor, like Yamato has, or less, it's going to penetrate if a shell hits this, regardless of the angle that it happens at. Now, if you want to reverse this and say, well, okay, we'll take New Mexico, which has 25 millimeters of bow armor. What shells can I bounce with that? Well, we take our 25 and we multiply it by 14.3, and we get 357 millimeters, which is basically 14-inch guns are going to penetrate, or wait a minute, math. No, so a 14-inch gun should penetrate through the... shouldn't penetrate through... A 14-inch gun will only penetrate 24.89, and as far as I know, that number is never rounded up. It's always rounded down. So 14-inch gun won't penetrate, but 15-inch will. And at Tier 6 in our New Mexico, we have Warspite, we have Bayern. You're going to eventually see Tier 8s like Bismarck and Gneisenau at Tier 7, which have 15-inch guns. So those are all things to kind of keep in mind. You can play around with that and, mess around with that a little bit more. So how does angling work then? Let's pull up our North Carolina again. Basically, every shell type in the game, or every armor-piercing shell in the game, has what's called an auto-bounce angle. And that angle is usually 30%, but some shells, like USN 8-inch AP and Royal Navy 6-inch AP, will penetrate, I think it's down to 24 degrees. And basically what that means is that if we are angled here, any shell that impacts this at shallower, so more likely to like this, so this would be shallower, this would be steeper or deeper. Anything that impacts shallower than 30 degrees, unless it's one of those ones that has the special auto bounce angle, will auto bounce so long as it doesn't pass the overmatch mechanic. So anything 16 inches and, almost 18 inches and below, 457 millimeters and below will bounce on a 32 millimeter front plate. It will not penetrate unless it has those favorable auto bounce angles. Now, as you start to open up just a little bit more, if we start to impact here at 30 degrees, we're going to start seeing penetrations. That can be extremely useful. Now, not on North Carolina, but if we go and we look at, say, Yamato, which has a unique armor configuration, you can see here that her front plate, athwartship armor plate, is actually angled. It's got a hexagonal citadel, and that can allow you to penetrate that if, you can line up this shot. So definitely worth looking in the armor viewer if you haven't already. This gives away a lot of ship secrets on where to aim. But anyway, if you can line up those shots, if you know what that angle is, or roughly, and it's going to take some experience to really figure that out. It's taken me a long time to really grasp when a ship is at the right angle for me to shoot at, and you kind of develop a third sense for it. Third sense? I did it again. Oh my. Sixth, seventh, I don't know, however many senses it is. You develop an additional sense, we'll say, that kind of gives you that impression of when you can and can't fire. So there's one other, thing I want to talk about, and that's normalization. It comes up quite frequently, actually, in discussions about shell penetrations. And this is speaking almost entirely in armor piercing. We will cover HE here in just a second. But normalization is the tendency of an armor-piercing shell to rotate towards 90 degrees or perpendicular to a plate, which is called normal, upon impacting an armor plate. This basically helps a shell penetrate, and the calculation done for it is done after it does the overmatch and auto bounce test. So it basically takes, if you were to impact right at 30 degrees, depending on we'll say it's 5% is your normalization, it'll treat the shell like it impacted at 35 degrees instead of at 30 degrees. It just helps some AP shells push just a little bit harder through armor plate, more likely to get more damage. And it is actually a real world effect. Some shells were actually designed to do this, and not to a whole lot of great effect, but it was an interesting, unique feature that was observed when they actually fired shells at, sufficiently thick armor plates. High explosives, in terms of penetration, I want to say it's 1/6 the shell caliber is going to be the penetration for all HE. The exception to this is the German cruisers, destroyers that use battleship secondaries. There's some other ships that have what a 1/4 penetration rule, where it's 1/4 of the caliber is the amount it penetrates, and that again goes, it doesn't matter what angle those shells impact at, they either pen, in theory overpen, or they shatter if you hit the target at all. And so that's kind of HE in a nutshell. There's not really anything super complicated about it. So let's put this all together. The key to doing proper amounts of damage is really knowing when to use a certain shell type and where to use that shell type at. We talked a little bit about using battleship AP, where to aim when a battleship is presenting a profile that's forward to you like this, and that you can't make it through his bow armor. You want to aim up here at the superstructure. Knowing that can be the difference between doing no damage and maybe doing 5, 6, 7k damage, which can just help kind of ease the battle along, so to speak, because these bow-on fights can be kind of stagnant. But more importantly, knowing what ships you can actually shoot through their bow and stern on, that's a pretty powerful tool, and that can be the difference between achieving a Citadel hit or switching to HE and trying to get a fire and shooting at the superstructure. And that's especially true on a cruiser. If you can get shells to land in another cruiser Citadel while it's bow onto you, that saves you having to shoot HE at their superstructure and pray you do damage. So knowing that is key, and that is really the crux of the whole thing. And I hope that this video has kind of helped you guys figure out a little bit more about shell types, where to aim, what things to look for on enemy ships. And I hope it really helps out. Anyway, let me know down in the comments what you guys thought. Like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you for watching.